Williams Knight didn't believe in miracles. He believed in data, in specialists, in the kind of control that money could engineer. So when he stepped through the doorway of his own great room that Tuesday afternoon and saw his sons running, actually running, socks sliding on parquet, arms open, laughter rattling through their chests like thunder, he didn't think it was a miracle. He thought, this can't be real. Liam and Noah, the boys who had never walked toward anyone in their lives, were sprinting straight for Laura Martin's, the maid. She knelt in a pool of sunlight, green uniform crisp, violet cleaning gloves still on, palms held out like she was catching something fragile. And maybe she was, because when Liam reached her, when his hands found hers, in a pattern Knight had never seen, tap, tap, slide, squeeze. The boy's whole body softened. Noah followed, crashing into her arms with a voiceless giggle that shook his shoulders, and Laura just held them, steady, unhurried, like she'd been doing this all along. Knight's briefcase slipped an inch in his grip. He tightened his fingers around the leather, felt it creak. His throat closed. He had spent 2 years turning this house into a machine. Routines, therapists, nurses rotating like gears, everything calibrated to coax a response from boys who lived behind walls no one could breach. He had hired specialists who spoke in probabilities and paid them to try anyway. And Laura, who dusted the banisters and folded laundry and wasn't supposed to matter, had cracked them open in 3 weeks. Knight didn't move. Couldn't. He stood just outside the threshold, half in shadow, watching his sons be held by someone who wasn't him, who wasn't trained, who wasn't even supposed to be present in this way. Laura pressed her palm to Liam's back in a slow, steady rhythm. 4 beats. Pause. 4 beats. And the boy went quiet. Not scared. Calm. And for the first time since his wife died, Knight thought, I don't understand my own children. Knight didn't speak. He couldn't. His throat was too tight, his mind pulling at the edges of disbelief. He stood just beyond the doorway, half in shadow, half in the autumn light streaming through the high windows. The sound of small palms tapping against violet gloves still echoed in his ears like something he'd imagined but couldn't unhear. Liam had dropped gently to his knees now, not from exhaustion but from satisfaction, his hands still resting on Laura's wrists. Noah sat cross-legged beside her, his fingers tracing shapes on her glove, slow, exploratory, like he was memorizing the texture of safety. The moment was already fading, slipping back into the mansion's careful quiet. But the damage was done. Something had cracked open, and once you've seen your children run to someone, once you've watched them find a language in silence, you don't come back from that. Not the same man, not the same father. Knight stepped back before anyone saw him. The door clicked shut behind him with the same soft finality as every day before. But now the silence wasn't armor. It wasn't order. It was unfamiliar, almost accusing. He moved down the hallway, slow, measured, his shoes silent on the Persian runner. The mansion stretched around him like a suit tailored too tight. Expensive, flawless, suffocating. A grandfather clock ticked somewhere in the formal wing. No laughter, no crying, just the constant clinical rhythm of control. It had been this way for 2 years, ever since Evelyn died. The boys had come early. Catastrophic birth, nerve damage, sensory loss compounded by oxygen deprivation. No one ever used the word vegetative, but it hovered in every consultation, every late-night specialist call, every white coat shrug that came with a bill, but no hope. Liam and Noah were blind, deaf, locked inside themselves. The neurologists had been careful with their language, non-responsive, limited prognosis, unlikely to acquire symbolic communication. Knight had nodded, signed papers, paid bills with fingers that never trembled. He had buried his wife and inherited a future made of sterile routines and words like accommodation and management. He was not cruel. He was not indifferent. But he had learned to stop hoping. Routine was safer. Control was cleaner. The boys had a schedule: nurses, therapists, physicians on call, devices that blinked and tracked and measured nothing that mattered. There was no mess, no noise, no surprises. The house ran like a laboratory. That had been the deal. Then, 3 weeks ago, Laura Martins walked in. Hired through a referral, she came with references and a quiet manner. Late 20s, black, wore her green uniform with care, kept her head down, cleaned thoroughly, asked no questions. She wasn't meant to matter. She was background, another line item in the household budget. But the boys had started tracking her movement. Subtle at first, then longer, more deliberate. Their hands would flex when she passed. Their breathing would change when she hummed under her breath while folding linens, a sound so soft the baby monitor barely picked it up. The head nurse had waved it off. Orienting reflex, possibly vibration sensitivity, nothing significant. Knight had believed her, until today. He reached his office and closed the door, resting his back against the dark wood. The silence inside felt different now, not protective, not controlled, just hollow. He could still see it. 2 boys in purple tees running towards someone who wasn't supposed to reach them. Could still feel the way his chest had seized when Liam's hands found that rhythm on Laura's gloves. Tap, tap, slide, squeeze. Not random, not reflex. Language. And for the first time in years, William's Knight didn't want to be alone with what that might mean. Knight didn't return calls that afternoon, didn't check his tablet, didn't review the day's therapy reports waiting in his inbox. He sat at his mahogany desk for 20 minutes without moving, staring at the grain of the wood, replaying a moment that shouldn't have been possible. The boys had a team. A team. Occupational therapists who specialized in sensory integration. A pediatric neurologist on retainer. Adaptive technology consultants who'd flown in from Berlin to calibrate touch feedback devices the twins never used. He had spent 6 figures in 3 months alone. And Laura, who made 8 tons an hour and wore second-hand gloves because the agency didn't provide them, had done in 3 weeks what none of them could do in 2 years. Knight stood and crossed to the window. Laura Martins moved through the Knight mansion in the hour before dawn, when the house still belonged to silence. She carried a canvas bag of cleaning supplies in one hand and a small zippered pouch in the other, the one that mattered more. At the kitchen threshold, she paused and pulled out a square of muslin she'd rubbed with lemon peel and orange rind. She tucked it into the door frame at knee height, where small hands might brush it in passing. Citrus for the kitchen. The scent was bright, clean, a marker the boys could feel with their noses, even if they couldn't see the room or hear her call them toward breakfast. Down the hallway, near the sleep corridor, she pressed a lavender sachet into the baseboard trim. Different smell, different place. It was a map made of scent, laid quietly into a house that had been built for order, but never for navigation. She didn't ask permission. She simply did it. Upstairs, William's Knight sat at his desk in the dim spill of a single lamp, reviewing the week's schedule on his tablet. 3 therapy sessions, 2 physician check-ins, a device calibration, a conference call with a specialist in Prague who'd published something promising about tactile interface systems for nonverbal children. Measurable outcomes. That was the mantra. You couldn't manage what you couldn't measure. Except the only thing that had measurably changed in 2 years was the one thing he hadn't scheduled: Laura. Knight scrolled past a line-item summary of costs. $47,000 this quarter, devices and consultants, and his jaw tightened. He had paid for the best. He had controlled for variables. And yet, his sons had run to the Maid. He closed the tablet and stood, needing to move, needing to think in a straight line. But the house had started to smell different, faintly floral in some hallways, citrus bright in others. He noticed it the way you notice a draft through a sealed window. Something's changed, and you don't know when. Laura found the letter by accident. She was dusting the library, really dusting, the way people didn't anymore, tilting books forward to reach the shelves behind, when a cream-colored envelope slipped free from behind a row of medical journals. It landed face up on the Persian rug, and Laura froze. The handwriting was elegant, looping, written in dark blue ink that had faded slightly at the edges, to the person who steadies my children on the ground. Laura's pulse kicked. She glanced toward the doorway, empty, then knelt and picked up the envelope. It wasn't sealed anymore. The glue had dried brittle with time. Inside was a single folded sheet of stationery, cream like the envelope, with a small embossed EK at the top. Evelyn Knight. Laura read slowly, her hands trembling. If you are reading this, then you have done what I could not. You have found a way to reach them, not with expertise or equipment, but with presence. I have watched so many try, therapists, nurses, specialists, and I have learned that my sons do not need to be fixed. They need to be met. You are meeting them. I can feel it, even now, even as I write this in a hospital room where the beeping will not stop. Whoever you are, you kneel, you wait. You do not demand that they come to you on terms they cannot understand. Attached is a legal rider, notarized and witnessed. Upon my death and the clearing of probate, a minority block of Knight Biologics shares will transfer to you, the one who keeps my sons company when the world is loud. It is not charity, it is continuity. You will have a voice in their future because you have already become part of it. Thank you for what I could not finish. Evelyn. Laura's vision blurred. She blinked hard, folded the letter with shaking hands, and slid it back into the envelope. Behind it was a second sheet, dense legal text, a notarized rider with dates and signatures and the words, "Minority shareholder transfer upon probate clearance." She stood, legs unsteady, and tucked the envelope into the inner pocket of her uniform. Her heart hammered, her mind raced. This changes everything. This changes nothing. She closed her eyes, pressed her palm flat against her sternum, and breathed. 4 beats. Pause. 4 beats. The same rhythm she used to calm the twins. She would not plan. She would not assume. She would stay present. That afternoon, Laura tried something new. She sat cross-legged on the great room floor with Liam and Noah, and instead of using her palms to communicate, she traced slow shapes on their backs with her fingertips. A square for the kitchen, a circle for the sleep room, a long line for the hallway. Liam tilted his head, considering. Then he crawled forward, orienting toward the hallway. Laura traced the line again on Noah's back. Noah followed his brother. They were reading a map made of touch. Laura's chest tightened with something close to joy. Dr. Patel arrived at 3 o'clock sharp, tablet in hand, skepticism molded into his posture. Knight met him in the foyer, and they walked together to the great room, where Laura was kneeling with the boys. "Show him," Knight said, his voice clipped. Laura demonstrated the backtracing. The boys followed her cues, moving from square to circle to line. Dr. Patel watched, stylus tapping against his screen. "Pattern seeking," he said finally. "Possibly some learned orienting reflex. But it's not language, Mr. Knight. Language requires symbolic representation, intention, abstraction." "They're following directions," Knight interrupted. "They're responding to tactile stimulus. It's promising, but let's not overstate." Noah turned suddenly and pressed 2 fingertips to the back of Knight's hand. Twice. Deliberate. Yes, Laura had taught them that. 2 taps meant yes. Noah was asking for a break. And then, small, uncertain, Noah reached for Knight's palm and held it. The room went still. Dr. Patel cleared his throat. "Well, that's interesting." Knight stared at his son's hand in his. It was the first time Noah had ever reached for him. Not in 2 years. Not ever. "Teach me that pattern," Knight said quietly, looking at Laura. She met his eyes and nodded. That evening, Knight stood alone in his office when his phone buzzed. "Unknown number." He answered. "Mr. Knight, this is Gerald Sue, probate counsel for the Evelyn Knight estate. I'm calling to inform you that we're ready to activate a conditional transfer outlined in your late wife's trust. There's a rider, shares in Knight Biologics, to be transferred to a specific caregiver. Do you know who that might be?" Knight's hand tightened on the phone. "No," he said slowly. "I don't." But even as he said it, he thought of violet gloves and citrus-scented thresholds, and a woman who knelt on parquet like it was holy ground. And somewhere deep in his chest, beneath the grief and the control and the fear, something cracked just a little wider. The storm arrived without warning, the way weather sometimes does in autumn. Pressure dropping so fast, Laura felt it in her teeth before she saw the sky darken. She was folding towels in the laundry room when the first rumble rolled through, distant but deep enough to travel through the foundation. She dropped the towels and ran. In the great room, Liam and Noah were already rigid, bodies locked in place near the window. They couldn't hear the thunder, couldn't see the lightning fork across the bruised sky, but they felt it. The vibrations rippled through the parquet, through their socked feet, up their spines. Their breathing went shallow and fast, panic building in their chests like a kettle about to scream. Laura dropped to her knees between them. "I'm here," she whispered, though the words were only for her. She pressed her left palm flat against Liam's sternum, her right palm against Noah's back, and began the rhythm. 4 slow beats. Pause, 4 more. "I am here. I am here." Liam's shoulders trembled. His hands fluttered at his sides, searching. Then, clumsy, shaking, his fingertip found Laura's wrist and traced a letter. L. He paused, tried again. A. His finger slipped, and he pressed harder, frustrated. U-R-A. Laura. Her name, spelled in touch, in the middle of a storm. Her throat tightened. She kept the rhythm going, steady, even as tears burned behind her eyes. Noah couldn't manage letters yet, but he pressed his palm to her wrist and traced a slow circle, then pushed down hard. Home. The sign they'd made together. The one that meant safe, together, here. Another crack of thunder shook the windows. The boys flinched but didn't scatter. Laura kept her hands on them, kept the 4-beat pulse going, and watched their breathing slow to match hers. The door from the terrace slammed open. Knight stumbled in, soaked through, his charcoal suit clinging to his shoulders, hair plastered to his forehead. He'd been running. From the car, from the office, it didn't matter. He froze just inside the threshold, chest heaving, eyes locked on the tableau in front of him. His sons, anchored to the Maid, riding out a storm he couldn't stop. Laura didn't look up. She simply reached out with one hand and caught his wrist, pulling him down to the floor beside her. She placed his palm on Liam's back, just below her own hand, and guided him into the rhythm. 4 beats. Pause. 4. Knight's hand was stiff at first, uncertain, but he followed. 4 beats. Pause. 4. Liam's breathing evened out. Noah's shoulders dropped. The storm raged outside, but inside the great room, 3 people drummed calm into 2 small bodies until the thunder passed. When the rain finally softened to a whisper, Knight pulled his hand back and stared at it like it belonged to someone else. "First storm," Laura said quietly, without a meltdown. Knight nodded, but he didn't speak. His throat was too tight. His phone buzzed in his pocket an hour later, after the boys had been settled into their room for a nap. Laura was in the hallway, refolding the lavender sachets, when Knight walked past her toward his study, phone pressed to his ear. She heard his voice through the half-open door. "Yes, this is William's Knight." A pause. "I see. And the name?" Another pause, longer this time. "Laura Martins." Laura's hands froze on the sachet. "No, I understand. Minority shares. Yes. Activate the transfer." The call ended. Silence stretched. Then Knight appeared in the doorway, his face unreadable. "You knew," he said. It wasn't a question. Laura straightened slowly. "I found a letter. In the library. 2 days ago. And you didn't tell me. I wasn't sure it was real, or if it mattered." Knight's jaw worked. "It matters. You're a shareholder now. In my company. In my son's future." Laura met his gaze. "I didn't ask for it." "No," Knight said, and something in his voice cracked. "But my wife knew. She knew you'd be the one." He turned and walked away before Laura could respond. By evening, the household had shifted. Laura felt it in the way the head nurse wouldn't meet her eyes during the shift change, in the way the estate manager lingered in doorways, arms crossed, watching her fold linens like she was cataloging evidence. Whispers trailed her through the corridors, words like inheritance and opportunist and lucky. The house supervisor, a stern woman named Mrs. Calloway, cornered her in the staff kitchen. "Perhaps," Mrs. Calloway said, voice tight with false politeness, "it would be best if you took some time off. Let things settle." Laura set down the dish towel she'd been folding. "I'm not leaving. Miss Martins, the situation is delicate. The boys need consistency. I'm staying." Mrs. Calloway's mouth thinned. "Mr. Knight may have different ideas about your role now. Then he can tell me himself." But Knight didn't ask her to leave. Instead, he called her into his study the next morning and spread a blueprint across his desk. It showed the garden, redesigned, textured stone paths, raised beds marked with tactile identifiers, and at the center, a series of water columns that would hum at different frequencies, vibrating just enough to be felt through the ground. "You mentioned this," Knight said. "Touch feedback in the garden." Laura stared at the blueprint. "You're actually doing it. I'm doing what my wife would have done." He looked up, and for the first time, his expression wasn't guarded. It was raw. "Teach me. The Palm alphabet. All of it." That night, long after the staff had gone to bed, Knight found Laura in the kitchen, making tea by the light of a single lamp. He stood in the doorway for a moment, then stepped inside. "Now?" he asked. Laura nodded. They sat across from each other at the staff table, and Laura took his hand. She traced the letters slowly on his palm. A, B, C, her touch firm, deliberate. Knight's hand twitched at first, unused to being read. But he watched her face, concentrated, and started to recognize the shapes. By the time they reached M, his fingers were steady. "Again," he said. So she did it again. The courier arrived 3 days later with a leather folder embossed with a clinic's logo, someplace in Switzerland, sleek and expensive. Knight opened it in his study while Laura was walking the boys through their scent map routine. Inside was a glossy brochure. Experimental cochlear retinal integration. Relocation required. Immersive observation protocol. And at the bottom, in smaller print, for optimal data integrity, existing non-clinical caregivers should be excluded from the trial environment to minimize confounds. Knight read it twice. Then he picked up his phone and scheduled the courier to return tomorrow for his signature. He didn't tell Laura. He told himself it was the right call, the best option. Science over sentiment. But that night, when he tried to practice the palm alphabet alone in his study, his hands wouldn't stop shaking. The courier sat in the leather chair across from Knight's desk, patient and professional, a silver pen already uncapped and resting beside the clinic's contract. All Knight had to do was sign. One signature, and his sons would have access to the best experimental technology in the world. Cochlear retinal integration. A chance, however slim, at sound, at sight, at something closer to the life he'd imagined for them before everything fell apart. His hand hovered over the signature line. From somewhere down the hall came a sound, soft, rhythmic, hand claps on wood, slow at first, then faster, punctuated by breathy giggles. The private game Laura played with the twins, the one where they took turns drumming patterns and tried to match each other. Knight's pen stilled. He thought of the first specialist he'd hired 18 months ago. A woman from Boston with a wall of credentials and a voice like a metronome. She'd sat exactly where this courier was sitting now and told him the boys would never communicate, never orient, never recognize him as their father. "Manage expectations," she'd said, as if hope were a line item he could cut from the budget. He thought of the device consultant from Berlin who'd installed touch feedback panels in the boys' room, $30,000 worth of calibrated sensors that blinked green when activated. The twins had screamed the first time the panels lit up. They never touched them again. He thought of the neurologist who'd flown in from Prague and spent 6 hours running tests, only to conclude that the boys' sensory pathways were too compromised for meaningful intervention. Knight had paid for all of it, controlled for all of it, and none of it had worked. But Laura, who made $18 an hour and knelt on his floors, had taught his sons to spell her name with their fingertips. The hand claps continued in the hallway, and Knight closed his eyes. 4 beats. Pause. 4. He could still feel it. The weight of Liam's back under his palm during the storm. The way the boy's breathing had slowed when Knight matched Laura's rhythm. The first time his son had ever calmed under his touch. Knight opened his eyes and looked at the courier. "I'm not signing." The courier blinked. "Sir, the clinic's offer is time-sensitive. If you'd like to review—" "I've reviewed it." Knight picked up the contract and set it aside. "Tell them I appreciate the opportunity, but my sons are staying here." The courier hesitated, then gathered his materials with the quiet efficiency of someone trained not to ask questions. When the door clicked shut behind him, Knight sat alone in the silence, his heart hammering. Then he pulled out a fresh sheet of stationery and began to write. The staff meeting was scheduled for 9 the next morning. Knight stood at the head of the long table in the mansion's conference room, a single-page document in his hand. The head nurse, Mrs. Calloway, the estate manager, and 4 other household staff sat in stiff-backed chairs, faces carefully neutral. Laura sat at the far end, hands folded in her lap. Knight didn't waste time. Effective immediately, Laura Martins will have authority over all sensory access planning for my sons. This includes environmental modifications, communication protocols, and scheduling decisions related to their care. She will also have a permanent, protected role in their daily routine. Backed by her position as a minority shareholder in Knight Biologics, Mrs. Calloway's mouth tightened. Mr. Knight, with all respect, Miss Martins has no formal training. She has something better, Knight interrupted. She has their trust. He set the document on the table. This is a family agreement, legally binding. If anyone has concerns, you can direct them to me. Otherwise, I expect full cooperation. The silence that followed was heavy. Then Laura spoke. If I'm going to do this, I'll need your help. She looked around the table. I can teach you the basics, the palm alphabet, the calm patterns, the scent maps. But it only works if we're consistent. All of us. Mrs. Calloway exhaled slowly. What do you need? The board dinner was held in the mansion's formal dining room, a carefully orchestrated event designed to reassure donors that Knight Biologics was still a sound investment, despite the recent probate complications. 18 people in tailored suits and cocktail dresses, crystal glasses catching the light from the chandelier overhead. Knight had prepared remarks, spreadsheets, projections. But halfway through the appetizer course, the fire alarm went off. Not a real fire, a sensor malfunction in the kitchen, triggered by steam from the industrial dishwasher. But the alarm didn't know that. Lights strobed. The siren shrieked. Guests froze, unsure whether to evacuate or wait for instruction. And from the hallway came the sound Knight had been dreading. Liam's sharp, panicked breathing. Laura appeared in the doorway, Liam clinging to her side, Noah pressed against her leg. Both boys were rigid, overwhelmed. The strobing lights meant nothing to them. They couldn't see. The siren meant nothing. They couldn't hear. But the vibrations rattled through the floor, and their bodies braced for catastrophe. Knight pushed his chair back and crossed the room. He didn't ask permission. He didn't explain. He simply knelt beside Liam, took the boy's trembling hand, and pressed his palm flat against it. 4 beats. Pause. 4. The rhythm Laura had taught him. Liam's breathing stuttered, then slowed. Knight kept going, steady, the same pattern over and over, while Laura mirrored it on Noah's back. The alarm finally cut off. The lights stopped strobing. The room went quiet. 18 donors watched a billionaire kneel on the floor and follow instructions from a maid. And it worked. Liam's shoulders dropped. Noah turned and pressed 2 fingertips to Knight's wrist. Yes, okay, safe. And the crisis passed. Knight stood slowly, his expensive suit rumpled at the knees, and met the eyes of his guests. My sons, he said quietly, are teaching me what matters. No one spoke. But something in the room shifted. The open house demonstration was Laura's idea. She'd invited the staff, Knight's sister, a sharp-eyed woman named Diane, who'd been skeptical of the Maid situation from the beginning, and a handful of donors from Evelyn's old foundation. 20 people gathered in the great room on a bright afternoon, sun pooling on the parquet just like the first time. Laura had laid out 3 textured mats on the floor, each one scented. Citrus for the kitchen, lavender for the sleep corridor, pine for the garden. Liam and Noah, in their purple tees and striped socks, moved between the mats like they were reading a map only they could see. Touch, scent, memory. They paused at each station, their small hands exploring the textures, and when they reached the pine mat, both boys turned toward Laura and pressed their palms together. More. The room exhaled as one. Then Liam toddled toward Laura and tapped a message into her glove. More. Noah turned toward Knight, who had knelt beside Laura, learning, and pressed his palm against his father's hand. Together. Laura met Knight's eyes. He looked stunned, undone. Diane leaned over to the woman beside her and whispered, "They're speaking. God, they're actually speaking." One of the foundation donors, an older man with silver hair, approached Laura after the demonstration. "We'd like to fund a pilot program. Your methods." Scaled for community access. Laura's throat tightened. "You're what my sister would have wanted," Knight said, appearing at her shoulder. He looked at the donor. "We'll make it happen." That evening, after the guests had left and the boys were asleep, Knight found Laura in the library, organizing the scent cloths. "Diane wants to endow a training center," he said. "In Evelyn's name. You'd lead it." Laura looked up, startled. "I'm not an expert." "You're the only expert my sons have." She set down the cloth. "I'm still figuring this out, Mr. Knight." "So am I." He hesitated. "Call me Williams." Laura smiled just slightly. "Okay, Williams." The call came 2 days later, while Knight was reviewing the Foundation's proposal. It was the vice chair of the Knight Biologics Board, a man named Brennan, who'd never liked Evelyn's pet projects. "We're moving to shutter the accessibility unit," Brennan said. "It's non-core, distracts from the real work. The vote's set for next week." Knight's hand tightened on the phone. "You can't do that." "We can, and we will. It's a business decision, Williams. Nothing personal." The line went dead. Knight sat in the silence, his pulse pounding in his ears. Then he called Laura. "We have 1 week," he said, "and I'm going to need your help." The boardroom was built for power, floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city, a table of polished mahogany that could seat 20 leather chairs that cost more than most people's cars. 11 directors sat in those chairs now, tablets glowing, faces carefully neutral. Brennan sat at the far end, arms crossed, already certain of the outcome. Knight stood at the head of the table. Laura stood beside him, a canvas bag in her hands. "No presentation?" Brennan asked, voice edged with impatience. "No slides?" "No," Knight said. "This is a story about silence. Sound doesn't help." He nodded to Laura. She moved around the table slowly, placing a small, vibrating puck in front of each director. Flat, silver, the size of a pocket watch. The directors looked at them with polite confusion. "Place your palm on it," Laura said quietly, "and leave it there." They hesitated. Then, one by one, they complied. Knight dimmed the lights. A screen at the front of the room came to life, not with graphs or bullet points, but with a silent montage. Liam and Noah, at 6 months, small and still, eyes open but unseeing. At 1 year, bodies rigid during a therapy session. At 18 months, a nurse's hands guiding their arms through range-of-motion exercises while they stared at nothing. The pucks began to vibrate, fast at first, erratic. The directors flinched, unsure. On the screen, a timestamp appeared. 2 years, 3 months. A new image. Knight sitting alone in his study, head in his hands. The vibration pattern changed. Slower now. Rhythmic. 4 beats. Pause. 4. On screen, Laura kneeling on the parquet, the twins running toward her, their hands finding hers in the sunlight. A new timestamp. 2 years, 5 months. The vibrations under the director's palms steadied, matching the 4-beat pattern. They could feel it now. Knight's recorded heartbeat, slowing as Laura's rhythm repeated. Panic becoming calm. Chaos becoming language. Another image. Liam tracing letters on Laura's glove. Noah pressing the sign for home against her wrist. The twins navigating the scent map circuit, turning toward the people who had learned to speak their language. The montage ended. The vibrations stopped. The lights came back up. The boardroom was silent. Laura collected the pucks one by one, moving quietly around the table. When she reached Brennan, his hand was still pressed flat against the device, even though it had stopped vibrating. Knight didn't sit down. He stood, hands resting on the back of his chair, and spoke. Evelyn built the accessibility unit because she believed dignity didn't require sight or sound or speech. She believed it required presence. His voice was steady, but something raw lived underneath it. I forgot that. I thought I could buy solutions, control outcomes, manage my sons like a portfolio. I was wrong. He glanced at Laura, then back at the board. The unit isn't non-core. It's the only thing we've ever done that my wife would recognize. And if we shut it down, we're not making a business decision. We're abandoning the people who need us most. Brennan cleared his throat. With respect, Williams, this is sentimental. It's measurable, Laura interrupted. Her voice was quiet but firm. In 3 months, Liam and Noah went from non-responsive to using a 30-sign vocabulary. They navigate their home independently. They self-advocate. That's not sentiment. That's data. She pulled a folder from her bag and set it on the table. I've documented everything. Protocols, progress notes, replicable methods. We've already had 12 families reach out through Evelyn's foundation, asking for training. This scales. And it works. One of the directors, a woman named Yates, leaned forward. What are you proposing? Knight slid a bound report across the table. Expand the unit, endow a training center. Hire Laura to lead it. Fund a 5-year pilot program for underserved communities. He paused. And rename it. The Evelyn Knight Center for Sensory Access. Brennan's jaw tightened. The vote was supposed to be a formality. Then vote, Knight said. Yates raised her hand first, then 2 others, then 4 more. By the time the count finished, 9 hands were raised. The accessibility unit would not only survive, it would grow. Brennan stood, his face tight, and walked out without a word. Knight exhaled and sat down heavily. Laura placed a hand on his shoulder, brief, steadying, and he covered it with his own. The press found out within 24 hours. A reporter from a national outlet called Knight's office, asking for comment on the maid who became a shareholder. Knight took the call himself. Laura Martins isn't a maid, he said. She's a partner. In every sense that matters. The quote ran in the morning edition. By afternoon, 3 networks had requested interviews. Knight declined them all. Some things didn't need explaining. Spring arrived slowly, the way it does when winter has overstayed. But by April, the garden was finished. Textured stone paths wound between raised beds, each one marked with a different surface. Smooth river rock for herbs, rough slate for vegetables, soft moss for the sitting area. Scent markers hung at intervals, sachets of rosemary, bundles of mint, small vials of essential oils that released fragrance when the boys brushed past. And at the center, 6 water columns hummed. They were Laura's design, slender tubes of tempered glass filled with recirculating water that vibrated at different frequencies. Low hums for the entrance paths, higher tones near the benches, a rhythmic pulse at the garden's heart that the twins could feel through the ground when they stood still. Liam and Noah walked between Laura and Knight, their small hands resting in the crooks of Laura's elbows, their bodies relaxed. Knight followed a half-step behind, no longer leading, just learning. They paused at the bench where Evelyn used to read, white painted wood, cushions in faded blue. A bronze plaque had been mounted on the backrest, simple and small. For the one who keeps our sons company when the world is loud. Evelyn Knight. Laura ran her fingers over the engraved letters, her throat tight. Liam tugged at her sleeve, then pressed his palm to hers and tapped out a message. Slow, deliberate. Family. Noah turned to Knight and pressed his small hand against his father's palm, fingers moving in the sign they'd taught him. Together. Knight knelt, expensive suit wrinkling at the knee, and placed his free hand over Laura's. 3 hands met in the middle, violet glove, suit cuff, and 2 small palms with green-striped socks peeking out beneath. The circuit closed. Laura felt the weight of it, not the inheritance, not the shares, not the title or the center or the press. Just this. 2 boys who had been locked in silence, now holding the people who had learned to meet them there. "They're teaching us," Knight said quietly. Laura smiled. "They always were. We just had to kneel down and listen." Later, when the sun poured through the great room windows and turned the parquet to gold, the twins played their hand-clap game on the floor. Laura knelt beside them, violet gloves bright in the light. Knight sat cross-legged nearby, practicing the palm alphabet on his own hand, his brow furrowed in concentration. Liam paused mid-clap and turned toward his father. He crawled over, deliberate, and pressed Knight's palm flat. Then, carefully, he traced a letter. D-A-D. Knight's breath caught. His eyes burned. He looked at Laura, and she nodded. Yes, he means it. He knows. Noah added his hand to the pile, and Liam kept tracing, over and over, like he was making sure his father understood. Dad. Dad, Dad. Laughter. "You feel more than hear" rolled through the room, shoulders shaking, breath stuttering joy. And for the first time in 3 years, the Knight mansion didn't sound like a fortress. It sounded like home. Knight pulled his sons close, one hand on each small back, and drummed the rhythm Laura had taught him. 4 beats. Pause. 4. I am here. I am here. I am here. Outside, the water columns hummed. The garden paths waited, textured and scented, ready to be walked. And somewhere in the library, on a shelf beside Evelyn's favorite books, a cream-colored envelope rested in a frame, its ink still dark, its promise kept. The house no longer needed to buy silence. It had learned to speak touch. And in that language, built from presence, not purchase, from kneeling, not commanding, A family had been rebuilt from the ground up, one deliberate beat at a time.